Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 36, Our Two Selves. I've been talking the last few episodes about letting go of coping mechanisms, or at least contemplating letting go of coping mechanisms. Thus, it seemed fitting to turn to the next layer of work that happens if we let go of coping mechanisms, which is doing the thing we were trying to avoid with those copes. Most often, our coping mechanisms like comfort eating or drinking are attempts to distance or numb our perception of our body or our emotions, which amounts to the same thing. You see, our emotions are felt in the body first because they are messages from our body. Emotions are sensations in the body that give us certain information about how our body is experiencing the situation we're in, whether we are feeling safe, whether we're feeling nervous, whether we're feeling excited, whether we're feeling angry. All of those emotions amount to nervous system signals that are basically saying, I'm at a good state of interest, regulation, safety, or something feels off. And we translate those to emotions. We use feeling words like I feel scared, I feel sad, but that's our sort of cognitive understanding of these particular body sensations, which are signals from our nervous system and body self. And these emotional signals use the same nerves as environmental and physiological signals that are things like our sense of touch, our sense of smell, our sense of our body in space and gravity and things like that. So our physical body and our emotional body are the same body. It's a very efficient wiring for nature to have used this pre-existing scaffolding of the connections between our physiological body and our consciousness when it layered in this thing we call emotions in order to give us additional environmental and energetic information. But that efficiency and double use of the same system means that our relationship with our body is only as good as our relationship with our emotions, and vice versa. If we struggle to fully experience our emotions and numb them out, then we inevitably numb out some of our physical body cues too. Or if we find the sensations in our body overwhelming or intolerable, we will struggle to fully feel and process our emotions as well if we are trying to suppress the physical sensations in our body that are coming for physiological reasons. It doesn't really matter which we're avoiding or numbing, our body or our emotional body, because the effect is the same. We lose contact with both. The way I like to talk about the splitting that we perform with respect to our body and or emotional body is to set down some of the more technical terms like ego self or dissociation, because those can have different meanings in different contexts, and it's not always clear which meaning is being used, and so sometimes that technical language can actually make things more confusing instead of less if you're just kind of trying to talk about a concept or have a conversation that illustrates what's really happening. So I prefer to just use a descriptive way of saying it. We have two parts to our self. We have a self that is, and we have a self that acts. If you want to think of this as body versus mind, or unconscious, subconscious versus conscious mind, you can. I'm not sure if those equivalencies are exact, but they're close enough to convey the idea. So if you confidently understand, what those mean, then you can think of it. It's analogous at least. But I'm going to spend the rest of this episode, and really probably the rest of the time in this podcast, that I bring this concept up using the terms self that is, self that acts. Basically, our self that is the part of us that experiences everything that we move through in our lifetime, both the physical events and the energetic and emotional currents. This part of ourself has no choice about what happens to it. It can't filter things out or pretend they didn't happen. It experiences all of it. And it stores all of it. So the self that is again what we might think of as our body self or as our unconscious. It's a part of us that we don't necessarily consciously inhabit, but that nonetheless is recording and experiencing everything that we come into contact with. We also have this self that acts, what we might think of as our conscious self or our egoic self. And this part of us can choose actions both in the outer world and within ourself. So obviously, outer world action is our choices, our agency, the things that we deliberately do. But when I say it can also act inside ourselves, I mean that it can choose whether to keep or discard experiences. The self that acts can choose to push away the memory of experiences that it found too uncomfortable or too overwhelming to remember and sort of keep in our conscious awareness. And when it chooses to push something away to the self that acts, it's like that experience didn't happen. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And that doesn't mean that our self that is has forgotten that it happened. But our self that acts is acting like it didn't happen. The self that acts, additionally, has power over the self that is. The self that acts can choose to physically experience things that hurt the self that is. The self that acts can override the protests of the self that is and do it anyway. The self that acts can ignore and disavow any discomfort or damage that its choices caused. But again, that self that is experiences them fully and holds on to the memory of them, regardless of what the self that acts wants or chooses. In my opinion, part of the responsibility set of the self that acts is to integrate as much of the self that is, as it can, into its awareness, and to make decisions that take into account the impact on the self that is. Basically, part of the job of the self that acts is to create harmony, alignment, and attunement between those two selves, between that self that acts itself, if we're talking about the actions that it's taking, and the self that is. The self that is has the job of sharing information about its experiences with the self that acts, kind of to help guide and calibrate the choices the self that acts makes. The self that is cannot force the self that acts to do anything. The self that is can try to get the attention of the self that acts, but if the self that acts doesn't want to hear, it won't. So if these two parts of ourself have been there all along, and they're meant to function synergistically with the feedback from the self that is, helping the self that acts to make ever more aligned actions and choices, how did so many of us get to this place of disconnection and disharmony, maybe even abuse between them? Because, of course, the whole reason for our coping mechanisms and numbing out was to avoid hearing the voice of our body, the voice of that self that is. Well, at the highest level, the reason we avoid listening to our body is because we don't feel safe listening to it. There's a variety of reasons why that might be, including how we were taught to behave, goals and expectations that our conscious self holds, and our sense of identity. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these. And I'm actually going to invert the order and start with our sense of identity first, and then end with our sense of how we were taught to behave and all that. If our self that is has needs or limits that we might have been ignoring for a long time, it might be that we've been ignoring them because they contradict our sense of who we are, what we're like, what we need, what we're capable of. I believe that a lot of adult diagnosed neurodivergent people with, say, like ADHD or autism have had to face this sort of schism between what they thought, who they thought they were, and then what their neurology is telling them they are. Since my diagnosis with ADHD about 6 months ago, I've certainly had to change some of my self-perceptions around how organized and productive and competent I am, because that lens is forcing me to listen to my body and myself that is in a different way than I had been. And it just seems like the message is do less. No, less than that. No, even less than that. And that's been really hard for me to see as somebody who had a sense of identity and a sense of self that, oh, I'm really productive and I'm really organized and I'm really active. I do a lot of things and I enjoy doing a lot of things. And all of that is true. And also, sometimes doing all of those things was at the expense of my body and done by ignoring my actual limits. So it's uncomfortable to have this sort of cognitive dissonance happening between your self-perceived identity and then this maybe objective reality of what you actually have the energy and the capacity for. But I don't think that only neurodivergent people experience this sort of gap between the story they believe about themselves and the truth of their body capacity and emotional needs. I actually think that this type of conflict has fueled literature for centuries and is something that almost every human who has ever existed can relate to. Maybe there have been a few lucky people who were raised with families that gave them, just exactly the right level of attunement to their body and reflected their identity just perfectly. And so they never had this reconciliation to do between their sense of themselves and then the truth of themselves, right? But I think for most people, and certainly most people in the modern world, and especially in the West, we do all have to do this sort of reconciliation to bridge that gap. And some of the stories that, we commonly tell are things like, I don't need others, I work best alone, that good old individualism. Or, I can work hard and play hard. Like, there's no consequences for that. I can do that indefinitely. Very sort of extroverted, I think, take on the world that says I don't have to stop and listen to what's going on inside myself. Or the voice that tells us I can accomplish anything if I just want it badly enough and sacrifice enough to get there. That's a really common refrain in our capitalism and our, I guess, American exceptionalism. That's one of the things that we're often told growing up again and again and again. You can do anything you want if you just try hard enough. And to some extent that might be true, but at what cost? And our self that is the part of us that bears that cost. So that's where there's this conflict between our identity and our self that is and its limits. But the specific reason that our self that acts, our conscious self, our egoic self, has these goals and these stories in the first place is because it's trying to gain or earn acceptance. And when I say acceptance, I mean acceptance from other people, acceptance within our culture, acceptance within our family, within our tribe, that kind of acceptance. Humans are social animals, and we need other people. We need to feel like we belong. And if we don't feel like we belong, we will do anything that we have to make it so that we do. That feels like a survival need on a deep level. And to some extent, it is even biologically true that we need other people and that we need to belong. So it can be a survival need as well. And that's why we fear discovering that these stories about us might not be true. Because those stories are things that tell us how to be acceptable. We believe that I need to be this kind of person in order to be acceptable. And so we feel like we have to accomplish those goals. We have to make those achievements in order to get acceptance, or to maybe not to get, but to maintain our acceptance. Maybe to get love, or maybe to maintain love that we already have. So that's why we don't want to give up those goals. And secondarily, we might fear to honor the needs of our self that is, that again being our body self, our emotional self, because we think that's going to take more time or more energy or more resource than we have right now. And that if we choose to honor the needs of our self that is, then we're going to fail at these goals that are so important to our self that acts. So it's easier to just not hear those needs from the self that is. Then we don't have to confront that internal conflict, that if we only have the resources to meet one set of needs, which do we choose? If we don't see that conflict in the first place, if we shut off the voice from our body, from our self that is, then we don't have to know that there's a conflict. We can just do the things that our self that acts demands, that our sense of what we have to do to be acceptable and to be loved. Like, we just go do those things and we don't worry about the cost to our body. And that's, again, part of why so many of us don't want to hear that voice. We don't want to hear the messages from our body saying, but I need something different, but you're killing me, because it's inconvenient and it might put us in detriment to the things that we think we have to do to survive socially. Sometimes I think all this talk of ego self and ego desires really sells short the underlying need. Like, the reason we have these goals and these desires, these egoic goals, these egoic desires, is because we are fundamentally viewing them as the key to our survival. They might not be necessary for survival in an objective sense of reality. And they might not be the only way we could get those survival needs met. But in our subjective belief system, in our conditioned reality, in the narrative that we are believing to be true about ourselves and our culture and our family and our life, they are necessary. So to the self that acts, those choices, those goals, they represent safety and survival. So how does that happen? How can it be that we get to this belief where the things that we actually need, that our body needs, that our emotional body needs, are so divergent from what our self that acts, our socialized self, believes that it needs to do to be accepted and acceptable and survive? Well, that's where that third reason comes in. What we are taught by our family and our culture and our lived experience in the world. For some of us, it starts when we are infants. I don't know if you've ever heard of this thing called sleep training, but that is definitely a thing that some people do. And for those children, that is the first experience they have of someone external to them telling them what to do with their body and telling them that in order to survive, they need to conform to this schedule that was imposed from outside. Same with being strict about feeding an infant every 3 hours as opposed to on demand. Again, it's telling the infant, you're going to be fed when I want to feed you, when it's convenient for me to feed you, because science knows best. Stop listening to your body and stop telling me, your caretaker, about it, because I'm not going to listen. If you hear in my voice the outrage here, it's because when I came to my experience of motherhood, I could not do that to my child. The idea horrified me of not being responsive to my child's actual needs in the moment in favor of some schedule that, had been devised by an average of infant needs, or for the convenience of caretakers, or the convenience of people who have to go to work while they're caring for small children and infants. It just, I didn't do that. I couldn't. But for a lot of people, this is where it starts. It starts in infancy. For some people, it starts with school. The school tells families when their children need to be there. And that means that dictates their sleep schedule. Either their time, like their bedtime, has to coordinate with the time they have to get up for school, or their sleep needs get sacrificed because they're allowed to stay up later, but then they have to get up earlier than they need to, than their body needs to, because they have to be at school at a certain time. And then during the school day, at school, the school dictates when children get to eat and when they get breaks to move, to play, to actually let out some of the energy in their bodies. So our children's bodies are being asked to conform to these rhythms that are imposed from the outside, which means they are being taught to ignore their own body signals and their own body needs in order to be socially acceptable, in order to fit themselves within the framework that is being imposed from without by the school. This type of ignore your body and live by an externally imposed structure is maintained by most adults in the workforce, because most places of work will define the hours of operation. Sometimes it's even very strictly defined as you have a shift from this time to this time, and that even includes dictating when they get to take breaks. To some extent, maybe some of us can choose work that is better in alignment with our natural body rhythm, but if we are working for someone else in a traditional employment setting, almost without fail, there will be some degree of having to conform our needs to the system as opposed to fully listening to our body's needs in the first place. Going back to childhood and the family unit, regardless of whether a family sleep trained or did the strict feeding schedule, most often at some point, children will be forced to disregard their body within the family unit's structure. They're going to eat when the family eats or when their parents put food in front of them. And if the family has an expedition or a social event, the child is expected to cope with it. Doesn't matter if they're tired or overstimulated or in need of a different kind of event, or a different kind of stimulation. It doesn't matter. Like, they're the children and the adults expect them to come along and do the thing that the adults dictate and, don't be a problem. Don't ruin this for everyone else. I think that neurodiverse children are especially stressed by these mismatches and also more likely to push back against them. But even a child that seemingly copes with these things and doesn't offer a lot of pushback or doesn't protest, that doesn't mean that it was actually right for them. It just means that they're prioritizing their position in the family and their safety within the family unit over listening to their body. Again and again and again, the message that we get is ignore what your body is telling you and do what the outside world wants or expects. And there's kind of a subtle or else there. And for some people, it's not subtle at all. For some people, it is blatant and abusively enforced. And, again, humans really are social creatures. We really do need others to survive. We need to be in relationships. We need to be in connection. And especially as children, our actual survival needs, our food, our shelter, our safety, depend on being part of a family. So it makes sense that we're all going to do what we're asked. We shut out that quiet voice of our self that is, and we prioritize the performance which our self that acts perceives as necessary for safety and acceptance. And that's just like, we have centuries, that maybe even thousands of years of culture that just go along with this, that just think that's right and proper and okay. And then we wonder why we all have so many coping mechanisms and so much distrust of our bodies and our emotions. Anyway, so all of these early associations and lessons teach us to live by our self that acts and to ignore or sometimes even punish our self that is. Additionally, if the family unit that we were born into is not especially nurturing or attentive emotionally, we can also experience the feelings in our body that correlate to emotional messages as frightening or overwhelming. If you think of a strong emotional response as a storm, like a storm that's happening within the body. And again, it's the same body. So the internal physical landscape of our body is affected by emotions. And if you have a child with attuned caregivers who offer comfort, then that child is going to have the sense of being anchored through the storm. They're going to be simultaneously experiencing the discomfort of the storm and the safety of having a comforting adult there with them. So that experience of emotional intensity has a felt sense experience of safety alongside it. So that child is not going to fear emotions innately because they're taught, they're conditioned, they are shown through their experience of being held and comforted through that storm that it's safe to feel emotions. It's safe to have a storm happen within you, that there's safe harbor and you'll come out the other side just fine. But if a child is left on their own and they're not given that attunement and they're not given that comfort, and all they feel is the fury of that storm, it might feel unsafe and consuming and dangerous. And so they're going to start associating emotions themselves with unsafety, with dangerousness. But you can't not feel things. So what happens is the body itself, that has this constant interplay of emotional reactions to its environment and experiences, begins to feel like an unsafe place to be. And so this is when you end up cutting off yourself that is, because you can't bear to feel the emotions in your body. It's less about maybe cutting off your body's sensation signals or environmental cues and more about the emotional cues. And, honestly, how could somebody continue to fully hear the voice of their emotional body if it's associated from basically the beginning with overwhelm and danger and fear? Like, it doesn't make any sense. If you have the capacity to shut it off, of course you're going to. But again, that also shuts us off from the full experience of ourself. It shuts us off from being able to hear what we need, what our self that is, what our body self needs. So this variety of early associations and lessons, whichever particular constellation of them you received, they teach us to live by the self that acts and to ignore our self that is. Sometimes they even teach us to punish our self that is. And as adults, we continue this disconnection because, in the first place, we don't really realize what we're doing because we've never known anything differently. And in the second place, we don't know how to listen to our body. Third, we have all of the fear that we might experience pain or discomfort or have to change a whole bunch of things that we don't want to change if we reconnect to our body and hear what its experience really is. And for some people, there might also be a practical element. They're already operating in survival mode and they cannot handle one more pressure or pain point. And so they might be aware of what they're doing and that they ought to be tuning into their body and listening and trying to deal with this and making changes, but they're at capacity or even beyond, and they can't. So that's kind of the story of how we got to here, how we got to this place where we have these coping mechanisms and we're disconnected from our body, from our emotional body, from this deeper self that is. If you're not sure whether you're disconnected, here's some clues that you might be. Being mean to your body or your emotional self. Maybe you push your body too hard, you deny it food or fuel or rest. If you begrudge that fuel or that rest, if you feel like you don't have time for emotions or wish that you didn't have them, big clue right there. Another is experiencing your body as something separate from you and your sense of self. Like maybe you feel your body is a vehicle that you drive, or just, oh yeah, that's a, vessel that my brain sits in, as opposed to fundamentally being you or being part of you. If you never or only really rarely feel anything strongly, whether we're talking emotional signals or body need signals. Another clue is being busy all of the time. Like you never really have time to relax, or you don't use your relaxation time to relax. You use it to do things. If you have low energy or vitality and kind of feel numb or like everything's gray, with maybe low engagement in the world or your activities. If you feel anxious when you're still, or if you feel anxious when you try to listen to your body, or maybe you feel frustrated because you're trying to listen and you don't hear anything from it. All of these are clues. And Also, I just have to complain about how limited language is. We don't hear our body with our aural perception. Like, we're not hearing it with our ears. It is a felt thing. It's just this wordless exchange of signals that transfer a message from a part of us that has no voice to the part of us with the will and capacity to take action. Maybe the message that we hear is actually images or symbols. Maybe it's memories. Maybe it is simply a release of tension that happens when you clearly think, like you articulate to yourself the message that your body has been trying to convey. Maybe the message comes in sensations that feel like emotions, pangs or flutters or aches or stomach drops, things that don't obviously seem related to the moment at hand. All of these can be how we hear these messages from our body self, from our self that is. And when we really start to listen to the self that is, we can discover needs that we've been ignoring. And basically, the pain of those unmet needs is part of what we've been trying to escape with our coping mechanisms. What happens if we do this, if we listen and actually hear those needs? We exchange a temporary discomfort, because it is uncomfortable to feel an unmet need and to feel a pain of having an unmet need. But we exchange that temporary discomfort for an insight that allows us to make long-term changes so that that need can be met and then continue to be met on a regular basis, as opposed to staying unmet forever and continuing to cause this pain that we need to continue numbing out. So when we let go of our coping mechanisms and stop that process of numbing, this is the information we have access to. And whether we experience it as a distress or a blessing is up to us. How our self that acts chooses to view the information that it's been trying all this time to avoid. Ultimately, our self that acts is meant to be a guardian for our self that is, to hear its needs clearly and to honor them, while finding ways to navigate to its own needs that don't violate the needs of our self that is. Our self that is that gentle part of us which cannot help but to experience everything. So it really is the responsibility of our conscious self to take those needs into account and to take into account what we're going to ask our softest self to endure. I know that I will be talking a lot more about this in the next few episodes, and at some point also the somatic recovery and connection part of regaining our full adult sovereignty. But for today, it is enough to introduce the idea of these two selves and to, I hope, inspire you to start thinking about that self that is and reconnecting to it and beginning to listen to it with a little more compassion and a little more attention. So, that is all for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in and spending this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. You can follow my lazy Instagram at thepatternbreaker, or you can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?